Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And as the first speaker after the town's 244th birthday, it's a special honor to be here. And so I guess we say the British are back. So I am, as Francis said, Chris Woolf, the author of Bumbling Through the Hindu Kush, and I was a BBC journalist for 34 years. And for 20 of those years, I was on loan to WGBH on the public radio program The World. So you may have heard me, if you're a fan of Marco Werman on The World 89.7 as the history guy, now and then, well, up to 2020, talking about the historical context for different events. But I'll come to a bit more of that in a moment. Obviously, I also want to say what an honor and privilege it is to be here at the Franklin Museum. We're all very lucky in Franklin. I look around the other towns around here, no disrespect, but we have some really special institutions here in Franklin of which we can all be very proud. So I'm going to start by giving everyone else a round of applause for choosing such a great town to live in. So my goal for our time together this afternoon, thank you for giving up your Sunday afternoon for this, is threefold. Tell you a little bit about myself and my experiences in Afghanistan, which will include a short reading from the book, and then to give you a little background about who was shooting at who and why, which could help inform, understanding of current events, and then to answer your questions about anything related to Afghanistan, including affairs there today. I know they're still of great value, and I think some of the slides might prompt some questions about the situation in Ukraine as well, so I'm happy to discuss that as well if we want to branch out on a tangent. So if a question does occur to you during my spiel, just keep it in your head and we'll come back to them at the end. There'll be plenty of time for that afterwards. Anyway, so let's get cracking on the journey. The book is essentially the story of my short trip to Afghanistan in 1991. And there was a lot of fighting going on, so it was a little bit of an eventful trip. And while it was short, just about 2 weeks, it was very eventful and transformative for me personally. But we'll get into that in a second. But I hear a lot of people say that the book is a great introduction to Afghanistan, and hopefully some people here I know have already read it or listened to it, or there's an audiobook as well, and have learnt a lot about the country. And I've been flattered by, even one of my Afghan friends said it's gripping and informative, but you could be the judge of that if you choose to have a look. So, I wasn't there on a total lark. I was working for the BBC World Service in London at the time, and I'd reached that point in my career where it was appropriate to see if this was something I wanted to do for the rest of my career, become a foreign correspondent in dangerous places, because that was one of the options we had. So I went there to further my career. It wasn't just a lark, but I really was unprepared and didn't really know what I was doing. But we'll come to that in a moment. So it was, as I said, a little traumatic. It's taken me a long time to come to terms with it all, and writing the book has been a big part of that. But despite the trouble, I've remained a lifelong friend of Afghanistan, and I've kept in touch with affairs there through my career in international news and kept in touch with its people. I've also been flattered with compliments from Afghans and foreign experts on Afghanistan, including this chap who actually was the top US advisor to international forces in Afghanistan and CENTCOM down in Tampa, and that there are some good insights into Afghan history and culture. So I was, as I mentioned, the history guy for the public radio program The World, and so other people say the book is quite readable. And one of the reasons I like to think of that is that my experience as the history guy on the radio was to interpret complex international affairs and the background to them and present them in a way that's accessible without dumbing it down. So hopefully some of that has rubbed off as well. And the other reason it's accessible is because I wrote it at my daughter's request. I don't know if she thinks I'm heading into dotage where I'm not going to be able to remember my stories, but she wanted me to write them down before it was too late, as it were. And it was very helpful to have her in mind as I wrote, because I know that she knows nothing about Afghanistan or war or even journalism. So I try, as the cheesy marketing line has it, bring everyone along on the journey. But why should any of you care? Even though it was a long time ago, I think it was hugely relevant to what we're seeing in Afghanistan. That's unfolded, the events that have unfolded in the last year or so, and what might happen now. And where do these great insights come from? So I think partly it's because of my situation outside the wire, as they say. I had the honor of meeting a US veteran who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and she said, I think you know more about the country and its people than I do, because I was just stuck on the base for 2 months, and I was not. I had to leave and get by outside in the mountains and bandit country of Afghanistan. So that was a great compliment. And I saw all sorts of interesting things outside, just ordinary life taking place in a war zone. And so I try and be humble about it, but I think the book can help you also get a sense of what it's like for an ordinary person to be suddenly finding themselves in a conflict zone, like the millions of people right now in Ukraine who never expected to be in trouble of this kind of life-threatening nature, and the things they have to do to adapt and survive. And as you can see, yes, lots of pictures outside the wire. And then I'm very honest about my feelings. I don't know how disturbing you find this guy's face on the left at the top there, but one reviewer called the book emotionally brave. So hopefully it'll give readers some insight into trauma, because it was traumatic. It wasn't disabling for me, but, and obviously it's nothing compared to what our veterans go through at all in any way, shape or form. I wouldn't pretend that for a minute, but it can give people an insight into this short 2-week trip. Gave me nightmares for many years, so it just gives you a sense of the troubles that real veterans and even real war correspondents can face and have to deal with and live with for the rest of their lives, and the impact that can have. I like to say I had a taste of war, a taste of fear. So it's really just that, but I think hopefully gives you a good insight. So why did I go? As one the first people who heard about my book idea said, well, there's semester abroad and there's what the hell were you thinking? Well, as I said, I was working for the BBC World Service, so I thought it would be good for my career to see if I would like the life of a foreign correspondent. And then I was very curious about Afghanistan. I'm older than I look, and I grew up on maps like this, where a quarter of the world was still painted pink, representing the British Empire. And it was astonishing to learn that this one poor, small, rugged, remote country had managed to best the British Empire, not once, but 3 times during different British invasions. This is the last stand of the British column, of the 44th Regiment, in 1842. Yes, the British meddling goes back very far and has been disastrous, as you can tell, of the 15,000 soldiers and camp followers who, and basic contractors, I think would be the word we'd use now, who left Kabul in the end of 1841. Only one European reached safety. So it was a pretty brutal place to be. And the third reason, besides to whet my appetite about my curiosity for Afghanistan and to further my career, was to catch up with my buddy who was stationed there, Chris Bowers. We'd joined the BBC at about the same time, and it was interesting to see how his life was going. Because obviously, it's 1991. There's no way to communicate with somebody. The country hardly has any working telephones. There's no computers, no emails. The best we could keep in touch with was using a thing called a telex machine, which some of you may remember, and which was notoriously unreliable, which Chris loved that because it kept the bosses off his back and he could work as he saw fit. So that tells you a little bit about why an ordinary person would want to go to a place like Afghanistan in the middle of a war. So just a little bit about who am I? Well, I wasn't a total novice when it comes to military affairs. There's a prize for anyone who can spot me. But yeah, there I am, there next to the sergeant graduating boot camp from the Territorial Army, which is like the British equivalent of the National Guard. So I was an infantryman, and if that's not the face of a trained killer, I don't know what is. But I was very lucky. My wife always hates it when I tell people, but I was the first person from my family and from my high school to go to university because I ran into a good teacher. So any teachers here, you really can change people's lives, so thank you, and pass on that message because it is incredible. I came from a high school where you wouldn't even think about going to university, and my teacher helped direct me to apply, not only to any university, but I got into Cambridge, where I studied history, so I was very privileged to have that support, and even graduated with honours. And then, not knowing what to do, I stumbled into the BBC and became a researcher for the BBC World Service in London. This is the former headquarters of the BBC World Service, a very grand, imposing building with the words engraved in marble above you as you walk in, "Nation shall speak peace unto nation." So there's no pressure or anything, so it's a very wonderful, privileged job. And I didn't realize quite how important and influential it was until I did a short 30-second story about a dissident getting arrested in Madagascar. It was translated into French, which is one of the official languages of Madagascar. And the next day he was released. And so it's like, thanks to international pressure, I was thinking, oh, I helped do that. So it was, a very powerful and important medium. And as you may have seen in the last couple of weeks, the BBC has cranked up its shortwave transmitters to broadcast to Ukraine and Russia again to make sure that the people there have access to reliable information. And happened to be stumbling through a variety of stock photo images and found this picture of myself at the BBC tea trolley. We were considered such essential personnel that the tea would come to us rather than having us go down to the cafeteria. But I just thought that was interesting because you can see in my back pocket a wad of rejection letters because I was competing constantly to get a permanent job. I was just acting here and filling in there, and found it very hard to secure a regular place, but kept my rejection letters in my back pocket as a spur to better effort every day to prove myself worthy, and somehow fooled them that it was going to work. So, enough about me and my background. I'm happy to discuss that if anyone wants, but I think you're probably more interested in Afghanistan. So I always like to start with this map because it gives you a sense of where we are at. A lot of people don't even really know how to place it on a map. And you'll see up here, you can see the British Isles and Europe, and this obviously is a map from 1991, so you can see the Soviet Union very prominently dominating the landscape there with its long border with Afghanistan here in Central Asia, right between Iran, Pakistan, little tiny border with China, and what was then the Soviet Union. And then people are often surprised by what it's like. There are some extraordinarily rugged mountains in Afghanistan, and that's where the book gets its title from. The Hindu Kush Mountains, which is an extension of the Himalaya Mountains, which famously includes Everest in Nepal, and then runs 500 miles through Afghanistan, pretty much dividing the country between north and south. And they are extremely rugged, up to 25,000 feet. So they're on a par with the Rockies, and very difficult to cross. There's really only one main road through the mountains, so obviously that has huge strategic significance. But there are also dry desert plains and fertile valleys. So it's a very complex combination of terrains. And then there's the people. So study this carefully. There will be a test at the end. Each of these colors represents a different language, and it's the predominant language in each district. And one of the most parlous things about Afghanistan is that all the ones that are on the border of the country, there are huge numbers of people who speak the same language, have the same customs, and identify as the same people on the other side of each border, whether it's in Pakistan, Iran, or what are now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and China. And so most of the people who live there don't recognize those borders and carry on their lives as they always have in terms of marrying and exchanging goods and services. And I think this gets at one of the central points of life in Afghanistan, is that being an Afghan is only one identity. We all have our disagreements here, whether we were born here or what political party we support or what part of the country we live in. We have little local identities, but we would all say that we're American first. You know, there isn't really any doubt about that. Whereas in Afghanistan, being Afghan is only one of your identities. You're going to identify probably more with the locality that you're from, the language group that you speak, and above all, your kinship group, the people you're related to. And those are the people you're going to be helping and looking after first. And each of those loyalties competes at the same time to become the primary identity, which is why it seems that people can flip sides pretty easily without any consequences, because yes, there is a small stigma to desertion, as we would call it, but it's not the same as the degree of shame that you would feel here if you deserted to the any enemy of America. And so that can explain a lot of the complexity as well. And so there are 40 different languages and 200 mutually incomprehensible dialects, and that's just language. Then you've got a mosaic of religious divides as well. So that's, I always like to say this because there's no way your average American intelligence officer can get to grips with all of that kind of detail and still be able to juggle or manage those competing loyalties, because it's hard enough to grasp what the details are, let alone how they're shifting over time. So feel sorry for all those poor men and women who had to try and do that, those officers in each district trying to juggle the different relations that people have. And then I'm going to show you a few pictures from Kabul in the 1970s, because there's this myth that everything there is stuck the same and has been, nothing's changed for hundreds or thousands of years. Now, there are parts of the country where that may feel right, where they're still farming with the same techniques that people have used for thousands of years, threshing wheat, you know, by flail on the road, by the side of the road, which I saw myself, which is an astonishing thing, because you feel like you're transported back in time to the Bible years where our ancestors were doing the same kind of thing. And on the other hand, that's a false image, because it's like anywhere, it's a very dynamic society. Things are changing all the time, over time. And people are always shocked to see pictures of Kabul from the 1960s, actually, because yes, there are the people in traditional dress, and there are people in very modern clothes as well, as you can see. Some students at Kabul University from the 1960s. And then a mix of clothing here as well. So one of the things I like to point out is that Afghanistan has these, I look at the clothes as a metaphor. The people in Western clothes are the educated elite, and they're looking for models for how to transform their country. They're looking both to Washington and the West with the hope of becoming a liberal democracy, and others during the Cold War were looking to Moscow and Eastern Europe as a model of socialist development. And what's really tragic is that these two elite groups forgot about the rest of the country, which is much more religious and conservative and less well educated, to put it mildly. I think literacy in the country when I went 30 years ago was 10%. And you imagine it would be lower for women, unfortunately. So very easy to manipulate people's opinions. So back to the map quickly. You'll see that Afghanistan is right in the backyard of the Soviet Union, perhaps more so than even Cuba was to the US in the 1960s because of that population overlap along the border. So that would help explain why the Soviets were so interested in the affairs of Afghanistan. And of course, just to fill in the pictures, hopefully many of you will remember or know already that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, but I'll come to that in a second. The Afghans did a great job of managing the Cold War for most of the Cold War, while the rest of the world through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s was being torn apart with civil wars as the US and Russian proxies fought for control of countries in Africa and Latin America and across Asia, our own experience in Vietnam, of course. The Afghans, I'll use the words of the last president of Afghanistan before the Civil War. He said, "I like to light my American cigarettes with my Russian matches," to try and symbolize how he would play off both sides at the time. But that all changed in 1978 when the communists who had been involved in the government just felt that they were about to be persecuted, and they probably were about to be rounded up and put away. So they used their friends in the army to seize power in a military coup, and started to impose all the classic elements of a Soviet-style police state, a secret police, rounding up anyone suspected of anti-government thinking, and anyone from a background that might suggest that they might go on to develop anti-government thinking. So government officials, army officers, local town officials, and anyone else, religious leaders and landlords. Being a communist government, they seized everybody's property, which never goes down too well. So imagine, and of course abolished religion, which is never going to go down well in a conservative religious country. So pretty much immediately, people across the country took up arms to resist the new communist government. And the communists may have had a chance had they not started fighting amongst themselves. And late in 1979, one communist faction decided to massacre their rivals and made the mistake of killing the KGB man who was the front man for the Russians. And so the Russians, at that point, decided to invade to restore their guys, as it were. I'll say their guy, he was already dead. And of course, being Afghanistan, all his family as well. Unfortunately, gets very brutal there. So Russia ends up in its own version of Vietnam, a quagmire pinning down hundreds of thousands of troops for more than 10 years. And it can only be described as a holy war. These diverse groups of anti-communist rebels rallying around their Islamic faith, and you may remember them or have heard of the name Mujahideen. It means the holy warriors, and those were the chaps never united, but they all fought the Soviets and sometimes each other with an incredible intensity. The United States wasn't sitting on the sidelines. It started to send aid to the Mujahideen on the grounds that my enemy's enemy is my friend. And so increasing amounts of lethal aid were sent to the Afghan rebels, and all culminating obviously in Stinger missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, which we'll come to in a second. The Russian occupation lasted almost 10 years, and this is the famous picture of the last military convoy leaving across the so-called Peace and Friendship Bridge back into the Soviet Union on February 15th, 1989, and leaving behind a puppet regime. And so the parallels and contrasts to what the United States witnessed and Afghanistan witnessed last year are pretty extraordinary. The Russians left behind a friendly regime, and the areas in red are the areas that communist government controlled. And it may not look like much, but that's all the populated valleys, the fertile areas, and the cities. And so most of the Afghan people are in the areas controlled by the communist government. If you overlaid a map of the areas that the government controlled at the US departure last year, it would have been very similar. So it's an interesting parallel there. But the big difference is that the Mujahideen attempted to seize power by force, just like the Taliban did last year, but they failed. And a lot of the Afghans and a lot of Afghan experts were not expecting that at all, as you may have seen in the news last year. Oops, let's not get ahead of ourselves before the warrior goes a-traveling. And the Russians, the Afghan rebels, the Mujahideen, tried for 3 years to oust the communist regime in Afghanistan and failed consistently, mostly because they couldn't agree amongst themselves and would occasionally fight each other. So that's an interesting parallel as well, because we're already seeing infighting amongst the Taliban factions in Afghanistan. And that was during that stalemate that I made my trip to Afghanistan. So now you know a little bit about who was shooting at who. The Russians had left, the Soviets, more correctly, had left, and the Afghan communist government was still in power, and the Islamic rebels were trying to throw them out. And that's when I went. There's me at Heathrow on the way to Afghanistan, ready for anything. It's November, I can hear fireworks in the distance, and that's a source of a funny story when we first come under fire in Afghanistan. So I wasn't really, to be honest, expecting to see much danger. I had telex to my friend with a message which he hadn't replied to, that it would be nice to see more of the country than just the capital, Kabul. And thinking we would fly from one safely held government city to another. But if there's any veterans here, you might recognize what's going on here. So it's my first day in Kabul. I look up and see the one plane that's left to Afghan's Ariana Airlines, which is the one I'd come in on yesterday. And you can see that it's dropping flares, which are essential to decoy heat-seeking missiles, which the US had supplied. And so flying in, I realized, next day I realized, oh, that was us yesterday. So there are people out there in the mountains ready to shoot us down. So that was a bit of an eye-opener as well, to thinking, oh, this might not be the interesting trip that I thought it would be. So instead of flying, we hitched a ride with an aid convoy to see more of the country. What could go wrong? This is me and my friend Chris, and I know there are large parts of the UN and the aid community that deservedly get criticized for graft, for want of a better word, and corruption. But the guys that I saw on the front lines who are actually risking their lives, men and women, to bring humanitarian aid and assistance to people in trouble, is absolutely mind-blowing to see the courage in action of them dealing with the things that they have to deal with, such as obviously the risk of crossfire and landmines. These are butterfly mines. They look like plastic toys, but those are anti-personnel mines that are pressure released. If you step on it, pops up to about thigh height and explodes out at 360 degrees, pretty much taking the legs off anybody within range. Soviets had a lovely doctrine of wounding rather than killing, because they were thinking, well, it takes 2 or 3 people to take a wounded person off the battlefield, which takes them out of the action, whereas somebody who's dead can be left there for a while. So that's an interesting way of approaching combat. Then rocket attacks, and perhaps most scarily of all, armed checkpoints. We were driving along outside of Kabul, and we went through multiple checkpoints with identically dressed people, and we stopped for a break, and I said, so when are we likely to reach rebel-held territory? And our aid workers laughed at us and said, Chris, we've just been in and out. Every other checkpoint was a rebel one, and I just didn't know, because they all look the same, and they all are pretty terrifying. And then we went through, I mentioned at the beginning, the one main road through the mountains between the north and south of Afghanistan. Obvious magnet for guerrillas to attack. It's essential that the Soviets and then for their successor regime, the communists, to bring their supplies down from the Soviet Union by road through that pass. There's no railways, and the planes just simply can't carry enough supplies. Immediately after the Soviet invasion, it became a ground zero for rebel attacks on Soviet convoys, and the Soviets decided to take a page out of Chairman Mao's maxim that the guerrilla warrior is fish swimming in the river of the people. And so they decided, well, if we get rid of the people, we'll drain the river, there'll be no shelter and no food for the rebels. So 50 miles either side of the tunnel at the apex of the Selang Valley, everywhere was laid waste. I think a lot of people, if you like history or military history, you may have read the phrase laid waste, but to actually see it in person is pretty striking, where you would normally see farms and fields buzzing with activity and animals. There was not a soul. Everything is reduced to rubble. The Soviets and their communist allies had gone door to door, driving away everybody with violence. And so every one of these ruins, you can see the ruins here of the one village, and there were hundreds along this valley, and it was a pretty striking thing to see. All the fields carefully terraced along the hillsides, broken down and empty. And so we didn't see any people at all except for soldiers for 100 miles, and not even a cow or goat or a dog even. So very stark education in war from the get-go. Then we spent, forgot to mention the hairpin passes and hairpin roads going up and down the mountains. And obviously there's a fresh 18-wheeler just gone off the side while we're waiting to get through the tunnel. And the whole, the whole of the valley was also littered with broken and destroyed Soviet tanks and armored fighting vehicles. On the way back, to keep our minds busy, we decided to count them, because that would be the good way to keep our minds occupied rather than worry about any more of the stresses that we'd been through. And there was something like 66 tanks and 66 armored fighting vehicles over that 100-mile drive, and it's, that's several battalions worth of vehicles. If you've seen some of the images from Ukraine over the last couple of weeks, you'll get a sense of what it was like just to see broken, twisted metal everywhere. And that was just the military vehicles. Then there's trucks and gas tankers and everything else there. And so along that journey, we met some interesting characters, and the book's subtitle is A Memoir of Fear and Kindness in Afghanistan. And I always like to stress how, despite the horrors and brutalization of war and everything that has happened to Afghanistan, 99% of the people remain incredibly kind and generous and helpful. And now, I probably wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the kindness of strangers. We were stuck in no man's land for a night, which I can tell you was pretty unsettling. And this farmer took us in, no questions asked. He couldn't speak our language, we couldn't speak his. We didn't really have any idea what was going on. but he sheltered us and fed us until it was safe to move on, and wouldn't take any payment. And then you think of the risk that he probably put himself and his family in for sheltering foreigners, because whichever side won, generally they thought of us as belonging to the other side. You know, the communists thought we were American spies, and we did get arrested at one point and escaped. And then we were thought of as Soviet spies by the rebels. So pretty exciting time. It gives you a sense of, you know, given the level of education, a lot of people there can't conceive of what is outside of their own valley. So you can imagine their imaginations are going wild as well. So talking of kindness, this is not the farmer. This is just a doctor in the north of Afghanistan who himself was, from what I gather from documents I've been able to find, on a government death list. If he'd been captured by the government, he'd probably been executed for just being religious, which is hard to imagine. But he sheltered us and fed us for several days as well. Not in a particularly dangerous place, but his generosity was the first one that we encountered. Obviously, when we're stuck in no man's land, taking photographs was not our priority, so I don't have any pictures of that. And then we met a very famous warlord, and were able to get his answer to the latest United Nations Peace Initiative. So there was some history taking place as well there. And this chap may look familiar to some of you who've students of international relations. If you don't know who it is, his name is Ahmed Shah Massoud, and he was one of the greatest of the leaders of the Islamic rebels against the Soviet Union. He led and galvanized the people of the Panjshir Valley to resist no less than 9 division-level Soviet Red Army assaults on his valley, and was able to withstand them, which now we've seen what Ukrainians can do. It's not quite so shocking, but it was still astonishing for people who started the war with just some old British rifles from the 1920s to be able to pull off. And he is widely considered as one of the best generals of the 20th century. And he was a bitter opponent also of the Taliban. After the Soviet Union collapsed, their support for the communist regime collapsed, and so then in turn the communist government of Afghanistan collapsed in about 4 months after my visit, and the country descended into a brutal civil war amongst the different rebel factions, and a very traumatic time for the country. Massoud fought against the Taliban when they emerged in '93, and he was the only independent commander left fighting the Taliban in 2001. And the Al-Qaeda obviously realized that if they launched their attack on the United States, that the United States was likely to retaliate by exploiting the local leaders and local opponents of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And so Massoud was assassinated by Al-Qaeda 2 days before 9/11. They knew his weakness for journalists, so they disguised 2 terrorists as journalists, and they had a bomb in their camera. And so the US lost a vital ally just on the eve of 9/11. And probably his presence would have made the US invasion even more successful, but it was not to be. I interviewed his bodyguard. This chap looks like an ordinary Afghan. Actually, he is a Russian. He was a POW, MIA, and we met a couple of these chaps, and this was the one who was willing to give me an interview. Now, it was through an Afghan interpreter, so I don't know that if he was speaking to me under duress, but he had converted to Islam and had decided to join the rebels. Massoud had personally saved his life from a vengeful faction of the Mujahideen, and so he gave his loyalty unreservedly to Massoud, and was, by the time I interviewed him, Massoud's bodyguard, one of only half a dozen bodyguards. So that's an incredible amount of trust placed by Massoud in a man who was a foreign invader. He got captured because he was a new conscript when he was 18 or 19, and the Russian logistic problems are seemingly the same wherever they go. His platoon ran out of food, and he and the other new guys were sent out to forage for food, and that's when he was captured, and he was very lucky to survive. I have tracked him down. He's still alive and has ended up back living in southern Russia. So an extraordinary fella. An interesting story about him, yes, I now know that he did indeed become a devout Muslim, but when the Mujahideen captured Kabul, he married a Afghan woman who was a devout communist, atheist, you know, and you would think they would have nothing in common, but they fell in love and went through a variety of difficulties and trials, but by all accounts are now living happily in a place called Krasnodar in southern Russia. So hopefully that gives you a flavor of of me and the times and the background to Afghanistan, and brought us up to 9/11. So I'll be happy to take your questions on Afghanistan in just a moment, but first I'll just read a little bit from the book just to give you a sense of what it was like. So just 5 more minutes and then we'll start the conversation. It's after lunch by the time the white 4-ton truck of the United Nations rolls into town. The letters UN are painted loudly in blue on the side and front. It's a comforting sight. Maybe we will be able to get back to Kabul before the snows close the mountain passes. The driver pulls up to my buddy and me. The dust settles. It's Osman. There he is. And he's clearly unhappy. I'm not sure if he's been on a private business or what, but I get the impression he's been sent to pick us up against his will. We're unable to communicate. He speaks no English, and we don't speak enough Dari. That's the local language. There's no interpreter to help us clear the air. I can feel the tension, but I'm not sure of its source. I know it will make for an uncomfortable ride, 2 days or more. I could be wrong, but it feels like the trust between us is breaking down. There's no time to worry about it. It's already late, and we're a long way from our destination. We can't be on the road at night, far too dangerous. We grab our packs and hop into the cab of the truck, next to Osman. My buddy gets in first and sits in the middle. I follow and take my place by the door. Life in wartime is a lottery of simple decisions about who sits where. I don't know exactly where we are or the route we'll be taking. We have no paper maps, and of course Google Maps are a thing of the future. We just have to trust Osman. As we drive out of town, I can't help thinking how different I feel now compared to the beginning of our road trip just a week ago. So there's me and before and after. I've grown up quite a lot in a couple of weeks. I've seen so much blood. I've lost my innocence and sense of wonder, and felt a degree of fear and helplessness that I've never felt before. I'm anxious to get home. At the back of my mind, I'm a little concerned for my safety, thinking how Mum would take any bad news, or whether anyone would ever even know if something happened to us out here in the violent heart of Central Asia. At the front of my mind, I'm feeling more pressure to get back to work in London on time, and to simply reassure my wife and family that I'm still alive. Add to all that, this new, unexplained tension with Osman. Despite all these unspoken anxieties, there's a tremendous sense of relief that we've finally begun the journey home. I push the dark thoughts away and concentrate on the scenery. The snow-capped mountains of the Hindu Kush lie on the horizon. In front of us and all around us is a giant dusty plain. This part of Afghanistan looks like the Star Wars desert planet Tatooine, at least at this season of the year. I've traveled a fair deal in Europe, Africa, and India, but this looks and feels thoroughly alien to everything I've ever experienced. You can see fields and meadows that might bloom green after the spring floods, but now, on the eve of winter, green is just a memory. Everything is dusty, dry, brown, or khaki. The homes, made from adobe, are the same. Their flat roofs and small windows evoke images from childhood Bible stories, or of Tuscan raiders. There are few people to be seen, not much life at all, besides the occasional herd of goats. The only signs of modernity are long, flat concrete bridges over empty riverbeds. It's otherworldly, it's captivating. The rebel checkpoints come and go. If the armed men wave us down, we slow to a crawl and lean out of the window shouting, Muli Matahid, Muli Matahid, United Nations in Dari. Usually it works, but sometimes we have to show our papers. We're traveling alone, not in a convoy, so we seem to be getting flagged down more often than not. I'm grateful that we're in a UN truck with bona fide papers. I can't imagine how we'd get through without them. For our driver Osman, the checkpoints are clearly getting tiresome. He starts to tisk and mutter at the delays. Up ahead, we see a kid, a goat herder. So this is not the actual kid, this is just a news photo that I picked up to help illustrate this one. So everything else is pretty much my picture. My guess is he's 13 or 14. His clothes are a little ragged. His sandaled feet are caked white with dust. His unkempt mop of black hair is also speckled with dust. He has life and death in his hands in the form of an ancient-looking AK-47. He's flagging us down, but he seems to be alone. There's no roadblock. His goats are off to the side of the road. Osman tisks. My buddy urges him to slow down, but Osman has had enough of delays. I get the sense he thinks this is one checkpoint we can afford to ignore. He curses and pushes down on the accelerator. I gasp. As we fly by, I can see the kid pulling the weapon up to his shoulder. He opens fire. So just a little tease. So that's it. Thank you so much for your time. I'm Chris Woolf, author of Bumbling Through the Hindu Kush, a memoir of fear and kindness in Afghanistan. And just so if anyone knows, I am donating a proportion of all the proceeds from the book to two charities. One is the Enabled Children Initiative that helps disabled Afghan children. I can't feel like I can profit from the book without giving something back, just because I was given so much. I'm still here, which is, I guess, the main thing I'd like to point out why I'm giving back. And the other is the Halo Trust, which goes around the world demining, removing landmines and other unexploded ordnance. And I got my rude education in mine awareness from these guys. My army training was useless when it comes to actually surviving in a minefield. But both those charities are still, despite threats and violence, working in Afghanistan. Halo lost 13 of its volunteers killed by the Taliban last year. But they won't give up, so more respect to them. So thank you for your time, and now the floor is yours for any questions you may have about me, my trip, Afghanistan, then or now, and a lot of the Soviet broken equipment that you saw is very reminiscent of what we're seeing in Ukraine today. That's because most of those vehicles are still being used, which gives you a sense of perhaps the paper tiger that the Russian military may be, that they're kept in use such ancient vehicles. But anyway, happy to take any questions. Sure.
I can't understand why do these people want the land when they bomb it out and they do whatever to it, or they live in caves, or they kind of. I just don't understand the reason to the fighting and how many different countries have tried to go into Afghanistan and with no results. And
there's no resources to plunder. There's no seemingly strategic benefit to taking over. I completely agree. I think if Afghans could be left to their own devices, they'll be able to figure out a peaceful way forward for themselves.
But even like with Ukraine now, you see it's being bombed they want this land? What's the purpose?
Well, then you'd have to be able to look inside Vladimir Putin's mind for that. And I have met lots of interesting people in my career. I've never met him, but I've read a few books about him. And the assessment of most of them is that he felt so personally humiliated by the collapse of the Soviet Union that he's always wanted to rebuild it along the same territory. And so it seems like his pride is the primary mover of this insanity, that he thinks, Moscow should rule a great domain that has these historic territories under its control, which in 15 different countries around Russia that were once part of the Soviet Union. And he's already been invading and bullying a variety of countries before Ukraine. So it seems he was badly advised about how easy it would be, and made the mistake of giving the order, assuming it would be very quick and relatively bloodless conquest, and obviously ran into reality. So lesson for us all to make sure we don't keep an information silo, as it were. But Afghanistan, yes, is even less attractive, if it were. It's hard to say. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your insights, and just to confirm too, it seems like, especially with, as you were mentioning, the Afghan and then the communities kind of crossing the borders, you can confirm the fact that there was no real border per se, unless there may have been kind of a geographical, whether a stream or a river or something. There was no, fence marker.
No, I mean
there's just wide open.
There would be a handful of border guards at any roads that cross the border, but you go 100 yards up the mountains, and then there's no fence or demarcation or anything, and people who live there wouldn't even recognize it. I mean, if we were brave enough to cross into Rhode Island, for example, it would be the same kind of divide. You wouldn't, there are subtle differences, but really it's not that much distinction. Correct. Lady at the back first, then Dennis.
Well, you said that the BBC is, again, broadcasting into Russia and Ukraine. So can the Russians go and jam the broadcast, or are people, maybe if they have a radio of some sort, can they receive the signal? Because the key thing is the Russians, they don't believe that,
right,
that they're attacking. So how does the BBC get?
So through most of the 20th century, the BBC World Service broadcast on shortwave transmitters. So I don't know if you've ever listened to shortwave, or any radio fans here. It's kind of bad reception, but a big enough transmitter will circle the globe, so that signal will go over the world. You can channel it and give more power to a particular direction. So there are transmitters that were built during the Cold War to face into the Soviet space, and most of those were turned off and mothballed when people moved to FM and TV in the 1990s. But the transmitters we're learning were never removed, and so those transmitters are being reactivated. And yes, you're absolutely right. Through the Cold War, when I joined the BBC, there was a constant battle between the Soviets and the BBC to try and you increase the amount of kilohertz you use for the broadcast. You can set up a jamming signal on the same frequency, and then whoever can build the bigger transmitter and blocker can interrupt the signal. So yes, you can try to jam it, but they just build bigger transmitters or increase the amount of power that goes into the transmitters. I'm not a techie, but that's what the way they explained it to us. So yes, the question is, do enough Russians have access to shortwave radios still? So I'm sure the grandparents do, but the younger kids population might find it harder to get good information. So fingers crossed on that.
Did Elon Musk do something with the tower?
Yes, I don't know how that would work, and I've seen some skepticism about how effective that will be, but anything is worth trying. Yes, and I believe he is going to try something. Dennis?
Well, when you were talking about jamming signals, it just occurred to me, if I live up near Medway, if I'm listening to WCRB and I drive up to town, all of a sudden the signal gets jammed by some local station.
Right.
So yeah, that's.
They step on each other, yeah.
But you mentioned that, you know, you were thinking about whether or not this would decide to become a war correspondent. I'm inferring that you decided not.
Yeah, you've that's the takeaway of the.
When you did get back, do you still specialize in an area of the world? And then part of the question is, what brought you to Franklin? What brought you to Franklin?
So that's a good multi-part question. So I was a specialist in Arab and Africa affairs. I've always worked in international news, and then became the news editor for the public radio program The World at the end of the 90s, based in Boston. So that's how I ended up in Massachusetts. Came to work on loan for 1 year. 1 year became 2, and then ended up settling in Massachusetts because I love the weather. But Franklin in particular was love. You know, that's what it is. But I remained. I got drawn more into national security, defense issues, and counterterrorism for most of those 20 years, and then with the history beat as well plays into that, which was a lot of fun. And then left that when the partnership with the BBC was dissolved in 2020, and I thought, well, I've never done anything else, so let me see what else I can do. So wrote the book and have other business interests as well. So yeah, love Franklin. Yeah. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Despite the hulks of bombed out vehicles, is there any other remnants of communism still in Afghanistan? I'm thinking that culture may have come over, or is there anything in communism that didn't leave over that?
A lot of people of my generation can speak Russian, so you'll find a lot of US officials were doing business during the American presence in Russian, because a lot of the people who fought against an Islamic revolution in the past ended up supporting the American presence for the last 20 years. So a lot of overlap in terms of individuals and families who attached interestingly from the Soviet regime to the current regime, whereas a lot of the die-hard Islamic faction people obviously were more likely to be drawn to the Taliban as well. So that, and some other physical presences, like a lot of the roads were built by the Russians, tunnels, bridges, and other infrastructure. They decided on the location for Bagram Air Base, which was where most Americans landed in Afghanistan for their deployments. So they shaped a lot of that physical military type of infrastructure. And there was some, yes, it was a regime of terror that murdered and tortured people by the tens of thousands. But they did bring up literacy rates, got girls access to schools, and things of that nature. So, every cloud has a silver lining as well. Yes?
What did you hear that would signify to anyone who met that you were a news reporter or journalist, so that it would be somewhat safer?
Well, that's a great question, because I had absolutely no preparation or training or guidance on that. The only advice I had was from an old guy who had reported the Bangladeshi War of Independence in 1971. He said, "Listen, old boy, just wear a pink shirt. No one's going to shoot you if you're wearing a pink shirt." And that was it. And so we had none of the things that you'd see correspondents with today. No boots, body armor, no helmet, no satellite phone because they hadn't been invented, no other forms of radio or any communications, not even a first aid trauma pack to help out if there was any trouble of that nature, and no way of getting messages out when we were stuck the wrong side of the mountains. And my boss in London God bless her, she's passed now, but she had this lovely story how Dr. Haidar saw our predicament when we were stuck the wrong side of the mountains and said, well, let me try and get a message to my people in Kabul. So he climbs onto his van, he's got the radio, and he's trying to reach his head office in the Red Cross office in Kabul. And he says, I think I got through. Well, I think, well, you know, that's not going to help very much, but thank you for trying. But it turns out the Red Cross office in Kabul did call Geneva, the Red Cross headquarters. They called Bush House in London, got hold of my boss and said, Chris will be late for his shift on Thursday. He's stuck behind rebel lines, which is one of the few workplaces where that's a good excuse to be late for work. And we were about a week late in the end, but we did manage to get out. But so, interestingly, when I moved to America and became, we were sending reporters, because the World is an international news program, we have our own reporters that we send to different troubled locations. At that time it was the Balkans, Yugoslavia, and they said, Chris, you're the only one who's ever been to somewhere like that. Can you look after our people? And so I had this terrible responsibility that I never wanted, to be in charge of correspondent safety for 20 years. And I'm very pleased to say that I was able to apply my experience and put it to good use, which is one of the ways to help deal with the trauma, was that I knew that I was helping people stay alive. And thankfully everybody that I sent out was fully trained. Like I had everybody chem bio trained before the invasion of Iraq, before anybody else thought of it. So that was like a good feather in my cap. I thought that they all came back in one piece. Now, some of them did also experience trauma because it's inevitable with war, but yes, I was totally unprepared, unkitted. I just wore whatever I had, which wasn't a lot because public radio doesn't pay very well, and we couldn't carry very much either. So yeah, what you see was pretty much what you get. So if we had tried to hike over the mountains, it would have been pretty tricky. If at one point we were stuck and we thought, well, the only way to get out is to hike over the mountains, and thankfully we found another way out, which had its own hazards, but survived. So.
But nowadays, would they get armbands or badges?
Yeah, so
Utilized to arm people?
you'd have press written on the side of the vehicle,
I see.
and the vehicle's usually armored as well to protect against blasts and bullets, armored plated and armored glassed, and you'd have a bright press painted and in the English and in the local language on the side, on the top for aerial safety, and then they would have press again usually in English and in the local language on their front of their body armor, on the helmet, and it's always blue because for some reason blue has become a color of neutrality, I think from the United Nations. So yes, there's a mixed debate amongst some journalists. Some people say wearing all that stuff draws attention to yourself if you're trying to be discreet, but on the other hand, if there is real metal flying around, then it's important to have that.
No pink shirt.
No, I never understood that pink shirt, but it was, when I got back to London, I never felt that I had been anything special because everyone had similar stories, and it's only when I finally left the BBC, I was like, oh, not everybody's been through something like this. So, yeah, so I decided to channel my work after that into live radio broadcasts, because while that's quite stressful as well, no one's trying to kill you, so that's always a good bonus. Always makes me laugh when people will talk about their work. Well, that's high pressure, but no one's going to die. And so, well, yeah. So it's been a wonderful career. Now I'm glad to be out of it because of all those stresses. I have a lot of friends working in Ukraine right now in the press corps, and I'm worried for them, but I'm not responsible for them. So that's.
Your focus changed. I'm sure your wife felt relieved.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. So it's all worked out well. Great. Yes.
So you mentioned that for a long time after you came did you actually move past that or move through it?
Well, that's another good question. As I was saying, didn't feel like it was special when I came back, and I didn't want to talk about it with my wife because I thought she might stop me from because I hadn't quite decided was this the career path for me or not. So I couldn't talk about it at work because it didn't feel that special, and I didn't want to jeopardize any chances of promotion. Just like you hear about military people, they don't want to like make trouble for their careers by saying it was a hard trip. And then I didn't want to talk about it with my family because I didn't want them to put pressure on me not to do that if I decided to do it. So it was a couple of years later that I started to get nightmares, usually about being trying to escape from somewhere like Afghanistan, and getting sometimes threatened with execution, that kind of thing. So I'd wake up with a start, and it wasn't so bad as to be disabling. The PTSD. Some people just get PTS, so it's stressful, and so you'd wake up with a start and a sweat or shouting or something like that, or have nervous reactions to fireworks, that kind of thing, which are quite common. But it wasn't disabling to the point that I couldn't get back to sleep, and I didn't miss work as a result, or like I say, didn't develop a substance problem. It was just maybe for fun, I don't know. But it didn't become overly dependent on substances like a lot of people do, unfortunately, to just try and obliterate those kind of memories. But how did I work through it? First thing was, I guess, acknowledging it and accepting it and recognizing it for what it was. And then I think the responsibility of looking after correspondence and making sure that they had everything I didn't have, and had the awareness about what they were getting into and the training that they needed to mitigate the risks they would face was therapeutic, because it meant like, okay, so it was awful, but it's been put to good use. So that part helped, and then being able to accept that it happened, and when those feelings come, you just kind of have to let them wash over you and know that it ends and it doesn't take over your life, if you know what I mean. It's just part of who you are. It's not going to go away. So you just have to let it come and go and work its way out without letting it disrupt your life. So.
It must have been really difficult to sit down after a period of 30 years to relive what you went through in great detail in order to write a book. It must have been really challenging.
Well, I was very lucky that I kept detailed notes on the back of about 100 photographs of names and places, and it was a 35mm film, so that all the photos were sequenced. So I had some of the chronology messed up in my head, and when I looked through the photos, no, that happened before that. So there was that, and then I contacted everybody I could find who was still alive to have them, validate or correct everything that I remembered, and that was helpful. Used every other piece of documentary evidence I could find, because I'm a historian as well on the side, so it was I have a very high standard for proving to myself what something is true, and where I have any doubt, I mention it so that I let readers know that, as far as I remember, this is what happened. Because there's some parts where I didn't really know where we were, so I can look at a map and think this was likely where we were. But for the night in no man's land, we just passengers with Osman, and so it's like, God knows where the hell we are. But it was pretty terrifying. Hello.
I'm just curious, it sounds like with your history of Afghanistan, between the British, Soviets, the US, there's either always someone in there or they're fighting amongst themselves. Has there ever been a time that it has been calm, peaceful, harmonious? It sounds like there's always something.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, there has been long periods. So there was a small civil war, if you can say anything like that, in the 1920s and early 30s. And then from then right through 1978, it was a long period of peace and stability. And there's been episodes like that through, it's the last 40 years have been relatively unusual for such an extended period of turmoil. Normally, Afghanistan's more like any other country in the past, 200 years, where there's episodes of civil or foreign war and violence. So that's not to say that the local culture in most of these areas, from North Africa or Southern Europe to Afghanistan and Central Asia, it's like we see with Italian culture, the vendetta. There's if a family offends another family, you can take revenge and are expected to take revenge. So that makes things colorful as well across that whole area. But Afghanistan's not unique in that. I don't like to single them out as being in any way like unique or different in that regard. But yes, so there's the last 40, almost 45 years have just been very unusual for the degree of violence and upheaval. But even actually think about it, the first 5 years of US presence, 2001 to 2006, was relatively peaceful and stable, and we were distracted elsewhere, and it was only really in the late 2000s that the Taliban really picked up steam again. There was only something like 30 US casualties after the invasion for those first few years. So we forget that we had some stability then as well. But, yeah. Yes?
Do you know any of the people who were left behind when we pulled out of Afghanistan recently? Do you personally know people who were left behind?
Everyone I knew back then, unfortunately, has passed or had left already. But that's because I was active on social media. I had several families reach out to me to try and ask for help, which is awful responsibility, because I have some contacts with defense intelligence types, and so was able to pass them on to people who can give them better advice than I could. But as far as I know, those two families are still both stuck there, and hiding for their lives, because one family, for example, they're from the Hazara minority. So Hazaras look like people from Mongolia, so like they're allegedly the descendants of Genghis Khan, and they're about 15-20% of the population of Afghanistan. They used to have their own kingdom, Hazara Jat, within Afghanistan, which was only conquered by Kabul in the 1880s or so. So they've been their own people for a long time, but they're a visible minority. They have a slightly different religion, and so they're very much discriminated against and targeted by all Afghans, unfortunately, now, because that's what humans do. They find people who look different and talk different and hurt them or exploit them. So if you ever see footage from an Afghan military patrol, you'll see like 7 or 8 guys moving pretty lightly with rebels, with the light weapons, and there's a guy at the back with a quilted vest, and he's burdened down with all the heavy rockets and supplies. That's the Hazara guy, because even in the liberation struggle, there's discrimination, unfortunately. Anyway, so that family, the Hazaras, and he was an engineer, so he'd been building US bases, but he's not an interpreter, so he doesn't get a special visa. So he got, his family survived a massacre in August last year, got to Kabul, and could see the US troops, but weren't able to get out, unfortunately. So, very hard. Hello, sorry.
Do all these groups, these rebels and so forth, do they all honor the UN and Red Cross and so forth? Like, you made it through with the UN?
Depends. I guess generally as a rule they will try to help, they will not harm charities or aid workers unless there's an issue with, for example, if a Red Cross official witnessed an atrocity, they may try and silence him. So, but otherwise they're generally allowed to get on with their work. I don't know if they're extorted to provide, for security, protection money, but I don't know that happens. But that's one reason I would think that they might be allowed to do that, because the economy is so broken that a lot of people get by with the checkpoints. Usually they're trying to extort money, and it's because it's so hard to make a living otherwise. So that's one of the reasons the Taliban is having problems now, because they can't afford to pay all the foot soldiers they had, and so they're looking for new employers, which means there's going to be another round of upheaval, unfortunately, at some point, because there's just not enough work. Yes, sir.
I'm just curious over history. We had Great Britain, Soviet Union, the United States, great powers at the time, none of them successful. And you're facing a disorganized military opponent.
So if you're a student of military history, you'd know that the way to knock out an enemy is to destroy his center of gravity. So usually that's the capital city, or to destroy his organized land forces. And you can't do that in Afghanistan because nobody cares about the capital. It's in some bizarre way that just triggered my history reference. It's almost like the 13 colonies fighting the British. There's Philadelphia, there's New York, whatever the technical capitals were temporarily, but they didn't matter because the fight was in the people, not in places. So capturing the capitals and cities isn't going to affect it. So the British tried to then destroy the rebel army, but Washington was smart enough to trade space for time. So you could do that in any guerrilla situation as well. So in fact, as an interesting side reference, Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap, the two men who led the Vietnamese wars against the French and then against the Americans, studied Washington's campaigns closely as a model for how to wage a successful guerrilla war. So testimony to General Washington, but a sad truth. Well, if anyone else... Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. If you want to have a look at the book, it's right here. And there's some free pens for anybody who doesn't already have one. Thank you so much.
This program was made possible by your Franklin friends and neighbors. Good folks just like you. Thanks for supporting Franklin TV. And thanks for watching.